We left off before with the Romans giving the ransom to the Gauls just to be saved in the nick of time by Camillus coming up with the survivors from the Battle of the Allia, who he had rallied at Veii. And I promised you a little bit more about Gauls and the rather sordid and sad little coda to the life of Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, the guy who was woken up by those geese and saved the Capitoline Hill. So, first, about the Gauls. They don't just come marauding down into Italy, and by marauding we mean settling there in large part, but they also end up going later on into the areas of Greece and Turkey, and they make a big impression there because these are people who are seen as stereotypically barbarian by both Greeks and Romans. And kind of in the same way that we will have our own sort of moral fantasies about the noble savage or whatnot, the Greeks and Romans see them as sort of the opposite of their quote unquote civilized nature. And so they'll attribute greater virtues and vices to them at the same time, being more interested in basically making commentary on their own society than really talking about what the Gauls are or aren't like. But they're also a little bit taller, big and scary, and they make a huge impression on the Greeks. As you can see from this statue here, which is pretty famous, it's in the Capitoline Museum, and like a lot of our Greek sculpture, we really just have Roman copies in marble of Greek originals that probably would have been in bronze. Remember that metals get melted down. They don't tend to survive too much unless they get like incredibly luckily buried or lost at sea or something like that. People will always melt down metal. So we get these Roman copies, the sort of tourist knockoffs that rich Romans would have commissioned. So here you can see that this Gaul he's got his typical Guy Fieri looking greased hair. He's got his torque, his little collar. He's got a nasty side wound that maybe would have been painted. And he is not doing too well. So this is, showing him dying, and you're supposed to probably see a little bit of nobility along with the savagery in this view of this, scary buff naked dude. So they make quite an impression here. This was probably actually commissioned by Attalus I of Pergamum. Point that out in a second. Well, actually, Pergamum is right around here. It's the small little kingdom that ends up allying with the Romans. You can see that he's ending up in the way of some of these Gauls, who will be called, this particular group is called Galatai by the Greeks. And they come down in the late 280s, early 270s, and some of them make it almost to Delphi. The Greeks in charge of the sanctuary asked the god, well, what are we going to do? How will we protect you? Because they were kind of freaking out at this point. The god said that he would look after himself. And then when the Gauls come marauding in, wanting to steal all the treasures in the sanctuary, well, boulders start tumbling down on them. There's a massive and very strange fog. They're thrown into confusion and flee in terror. Obviously, this is exactly what happened. And they also do meet with some success, though. They do away with this fine fellow, Ptolemy Ceraunus, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, because I guess he was a bit rash. He was the first son of Ptolemy the First, and so he would have been the heir to the Ptolemaic kingdom, that is largely Egypt and some of the areas down around here. That was one of the successor kingdoms when Alexander the Great's very short-lived empire broke apart, because Alexander, quite prudently, when he's on his deathbed and is asked who his empire is going to go to, says, to the strongest. Good job. So Ptolemy Ceraunus, he ends up falling out of favor when his dad has a second wife. He goes up here to Macedonia, one of the other successor kingdoms, which is currently ruled by Lysimachus, whose son has married his Ptolemy Ceraunus's full sister, Lysandra, but that son gets done away with in rather mysterious circumstances, and Ptolemy and Lysandra flee. when Lysimachus ends up fighting the guy who is in control of more around this area and the area that would later come to be the Parthian and Persian kingdoms, a guy named Seleucus, the last major general who was under Alexander the Great. He defeats Lysimachus at Corympedium, and Ptolemy Ceraunus ends up with him. Seems like he's either going to be used for some sort of like political maneuvering, or maybe he's going to be set up as a lieutenant, perhaps governing some of these areas. But Ptolemy Ceraunus, being a totally stand-up guy, murders Seleucus while he is sacrificing and ends up himself being king of Macedonia. But that doesn't last too long. As the Gauls come down, Ptolemy dies, has his head cut off, and quite possibly turned into a ceremonial drinking cup, which is, if you're a Gaul, just what you do when you kill a king, you know? I guess it's like the ancient version of collectibles. So some of these Gauls end up over here eventually and settle in the middle of Turkey. And you might recognize this word Galatia because there is a biblical book called Galatians. Note that a lot of the biblical books that have like place names like Corinthians, whatever, Romans, those are all basically in the form of letters addressed to early Christian communities in these areas. So Galatians would be letters sent to these people here who eventually turn Christian. But before that happens, they end up being a sort of scary mercenary force that is hired out and by various kings around here, and they go marauding for a while, but they gradually realize, if we kill who the people are willing to pay us to kill, we can do a little bit better for ourselves. And so that's how you end up with a bunch of Gauls, essentially, in the middle of Turkey. So now moving on to Manlius, Marcus Manlius Capitolinus. He is going to have a rather bad end. And it's worth taking a look at how this happens in Livy, because we see a Roman hero, someone who has basically saved the city and gone from the absolute peak of fame at Rome, go to, well, you'll see. So he takes advantage of this common dynamic in Rome and a lot of other ancient cities where you basically have long-standing class warfare of a sort, where you have an upper class that is ruling and they will oppress the lower classes as much as they can get away with. And anyone who wants to sort of make a sort of quick political name for themselves might try to promise things to the lower classes and take advantage of this continually seething resentment between the two groups. This is going to happen at the particular point where the Romans are about to deal with another war. It's always a good time to exploit this when you suddenly need to have everyone come up together to, sign up for military service here. That puts a lot of pressure that you don't normally have. So, picking up with Livy, the schism originated where such a thing was least to be apprehended, with a man of patrician family and high renown, Marcus Manlius Capitolinus. This man, scorning, in his overweening pride, the other nobles, but envying the one who excelled them all in honors and good qualities, namely Marcus Furius, could ill endure that Camillus should have attained to such solitary eminence both amongst the magistrates and in the armies, as to have those who had been chosen under the same auspices not for colleagues, but for servants. So Camillus is basically the chief man in Rome, even when he has colleagues in office here. He is so famous, so important that everyone defers to him. He is seen as the pretty much savior of Rome, and the guy who knocked a bunch of Gauls off the hill with the help of some geese is a bit jealous. So, whereas if one considered the situation fairly, it would have been impossible for Marcus Furius to redeem his native city from the league of her enemies unless Manlius himself had before that saved the capital and the citadel. Camillus had assailed the Gauls while they were receiving the gold, and while their resolution was relaxed by thoughts of peace. But he himself had driven them back as they came on sword in hand in the act of taking the citadel. Of the glory of Camillus, a goodly portion belonged to all the soldiers who had conquered with him. In his own victory, it was acknowledged that no mortal whosoever had a share, except the geese. So before moving on, just a few terms. So the plebs, of course, is the common people. We also call them the plebeians if we want to use the longer form of the word. And in a traditional aristocratic society, well, the plebs, the common people, they are common. They are not seen as exactly all that great. And it's pretty easy to blame them for being fickle. They'll change their mind a lot. They're greedy. They aren't so moral. You can generally get them to do bad stuff. And they're just always on the lookout for any opportunity to profit. But the opposite of that is the optimates, the aristocrats. The word aristocrat comes from aristos in Greek, which means best, and krat is power. So it's ruled by the best people. You can tell who made this word. And obviously the people that are wealthy, well, they're also the best people. They wouldn't be wealthy if they weren't the best, the most noble, favored by the gods, the hardest working. There's nothing to do with inherited wealth or position here. No, that couldn't be the case. So sometimes the Romans will even just call them boni, the good people, as opposed to the plebs who are, not so good, easily corruptible. So you have that sort of class tension going on. Now, if you want to label somebody who is your political opposition as not okay, well, you might call them a factio. Obviously, our word faction comes from this in English, but in English, you can use it kind of neutrally. You could say, there are many factions vying for control of whatever organization you're interested in. But in Latin, factio is always bad. If someone makes a factio, they are coming together for some illicit, some improper, immoral purpose, and they're probably using sketchy means to do so. But if you oppose this factio and you get your own group of people together, well, you are just amici. You're friends. You're nice people helping out, working together. And you can see that there's really no functional difference between what you would be doing if you're in a factio or you are just amici. It's just what you call what the people you like and the people you don't. You're always going to sort of attribute bad motives, bad methods to the people you oppose. And this is just kind of general political way of talking. Now, if you want to call someone into particular disrepute, let's say there's one big person who is getting a little too important, a little too arrogant. Well, the accusation you would make is you would accuse them of aiming at regnum. Regnum is royal rule. You can recognize the word reg in there from rex regis for king. And the Romans, if you recall, do not like kings. They kick out the Tarquins, swear never to have another king again, and most of their political system with, at the very least, dual magistrates, that you have two consuls, pretty much everything but the dictator has more than one person so that no person can abuse their power, and dictators are only for emergencies. Well, kings are possibly the worst thing you could have for the Romans. And so if you accuse someone of aiming at regnum, royal rule, maybe you mean it literally, like, okay, this person's wanting to become a king, but you can also use it to mean that they are just trying to take more power than any one person should have. Though, of course, you're not going to admit that you're using it in that slightly less extreme form. But regnum is the big sort of thing you can accuse a major politician of. It's kind of like in America and most of the 20th century, you can just shout communist at someone, and we know that most of the time that there's no connection to communism or understanding of what that word even means. But it's a good sort of thing to shout at someone you don't like. Now, another word to look at, res novae, revolution. This, in a very traditional society, it kind of makes sense why it means this, because, well, res novae are just new things. Well, if you're in a traditional society, anything new is always bad, right? So res novae, revolution, oh no. Very often, though, this has to do with canceling debts. And one of the big things that happens is people get wealthy largely by exploiting other people's poorness, poverty. And so debts end up being the major thing. Farmers have difficulty going into debt if there's a bad season. People, just for a variety of reasons, end up in debt. And in the Roman system, for a while, you can even be reduced to debt bondage, kind of like, in the sort of like early American colonial period, right, where you have indentured servants and whatnot. So res novae is revolution, but it's not just, like the glorious Soviet Revolution or anything like that, but instead it is more just canceling debts in a lot of ways, maybe redistributing a little bit of property, giving some of the land that the aristocrats are usually illegally squatting on and exploiting for their own gain, to people more generally. But it has a lot of various connotations and isn't super specific. Now, back to our story. So, we saw that that Capitolinus was not too happy with Camillus being really the hero of the day and his, exploits, knocking a few guys off the Capitol and forgetting about the geese, is not quite getting him the fame he wants. So, puffed up with these opinions, and besides, through a defect of nature, impetuous and passionate, when he perceived that his abilities did not bring him that leadership amongst the nobles which he thought that they merited, he was first of all the patricians to turn demagogue, and cast his lot in with the plebeian magistrates. Now, this word is fun too, demagogue. This comes from the Greek. The ago agein is a Greek word that is related to ago agere in Latin, which can mean to lead. So you lead, but you lead the demos, the people. This is at the root of our word democracy and stuff like that. But you can imagine that if you're leading the people around, and unlike us, you tend to think, the people, that's a sketchy group. You don't want the common people making decisions or having them be in charge. They're easy to lead. They're easy to, con into doing all sorts of silly things. Well, that's not a good thing. Demagoguery is basically when you sort of exploit the common people's passions, where you stir them up for your own political gain. Because, of course, you are not doing this because you actually care about them. No, it is, in fact, just they're easy to manipulate. And this is a word that you should store away in the back of your mind, because it becomes quite relevant throughout history. It is not just a Greek or a Roman phenomenon. Demagoguery is sadly relevant. So, he abused the nobles, by which we mean insulted them. He courted the favor of the plebs and swept along by the breath of popularity, and not by good counsel, chose rather to be reputed great than virtuous. Moreover, not content with agrarian proposals, redistributing land, like I said before, public land that was honestly being exploited by the nobles at this point, which had ever served the tribunes to stir up sedition, he began an attack on credit, by which we mean debt. For he held that debt was a sharper goad, since it not only threatened poverty and shame, but terrified the free man with the thought of shackles and imprisonment. And, in fact, there had been a vast piling up of debts by reason of a thing that is ruinous even to the rich, to wit, building. Don't build too many buildings, you'll go into debt. And so the Volscian War, the war that's threatening at this point, grave in itself, made still graver by the defection of the Latins and the Hernici. These people had sort of decided they could abandon the Romans and didn't have to listen to them anymore after the whole Gallic sack incident, was alleged as a reason for seeking a greater authority. But the revolutionary schemes of Manlius were the more compelling cause of the Senate's naming a dictator. So we're in emergency mode here. They appointed Aulus Cornelius Cassus, who appointed as his master of horse Titus Quinctius Capitolinus. The dictator always has a lackey, his sort of assistant. He is sort of like junior dictator, and he's called the master of horse, by which mean cavalry, not just horses, because, yeah. So, the dictator maintained his army in camp, not doubting in the least that the Senate would declare war on those nations, when a greater disturbance broke out at home and obliged them to summon him to the city, where the sedition was increasing from day to day, and occasioned more than the usual alarm by reason of the man who was behind it. For now, not only the speeches of Marcus Manlius, but his actions as well, while ostensibly democratic, were really revolutionary, considering the purpose which inspired them. So now we're going to see a little bit of demagoguery in action here, how you stir the people up with a convenient little scapegoat or demonstration of something. So, a centurion renowned for military prowess had been condemned for debt. As he was being led away, Manlius caught sight of him, and, hastening to his side through the midst of the forum with his band of retainers, he laid hold of him, and exclaiming at the arrogance of the patricians, the heartlessness of the moneylenders, the suffering of the plebs, and the merits and misfortune of this man, cried, "Then, in very truth, was it all in vain? With this right hand I saved the Capitol and the citadel, if I am to see my fellow citizen and fellow soldier carried off a captive, as though the Gauls had conquered us." Well, they kind of did. "To servitude and chains." He then paid the money to the creditor in full sight of the people, and with the ceremony of the scales and bronze redeemed the debtor and set him free, to invoke the blessings of the gods and men on Marcus Manlius, his liberator, the father of the Roman plebs. So, you make a quick little demonstration with one person. I'm sure, if he really cared, Marcus Manlius, like any good rich person, could have helped a lot more people, but you make one example, stirs people up. So he also has an additional thing. He starts to traffic in conspiracy theories, another good tool of the demagogue. You can often rile people up. And remember that whole gold payment the Romans were trying to make? Well, people wonder, where is it? What happened to that? And he claims that a bunch of the senators had just sort of absconded with it, taken it for themselves. And he doesn't really have any proof, though, but that we can get people to believe things without proof. So this is a little bit from his conspiracy theory. When, they said, it had been necessary to raise gold for the redemption of their city from the Gauls, it had been collected by taxation, but this same gold, after being captured from the enemy, had become the spoil of a few. They therefore persistently demanded to be told where all that stolen money was hid. And when he put them off with the promise he would tell them at the proper time, I won't tell you now, of course, that shouldn't raise any suspicions, they dropped their other concerns and became one and all so absorbed in this that it was evident that he would reap no little gratitude if his report proved true, and no small offense if it turned out to be false. So the people really want to find this money. Gets a bit out of hand. He comes to meet the dictator, and the dictator's trying to put an end to this in a sort of public meeting. So the dictator bade him to cease to quibble and insisted that he should either make his indictment good or confess the crime of having accused the Senate falsely and exposed it to the unmerited odium, that's hatred, of a charge of theft. And when Manlius refused to speak at the pleasure of his enemies, because he doesn't have anything to say, he commanded him to be imprisoned. On being arrested by the attendant, Manlius cried out, "Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, and Queen Juno, and Minerva, and all ye other gods and goddesses that dwell in the Capitol and in the citadel, is it thus ye suffer your soldier and protector to be tormented by his adversaries? Shall this right arm wherewith I rout the Gauls from your shrines now be chained and fettered?" I mean, he's really playing up that one thing he did here. There was none that could endure to behold or hear his shame, but there were certain rules of conduct which the citizens, deeply submissive to regular authority, had made inviolable. Nor did either the tribunes of the plebs or the plebs themselves dare to lift their eyes or open their mouths against the power of the dictator. But after Manlius was cast into jail, it is certain that a great part of the people put on mourning, and that many men permitted their hair and beards to grow, and that a mournful throng hung about the entrance to the prison. So the Senate tries to get people back on their side. They're like, okay, we'll let him go. We've ended this. Just don't listen to this garbage. But then they let him go, and Manlius just keeps going. "The time has come to attempt even greater things," he said. "Do but make a trial of your own good fortune and of me, whom, as I think, you have already happily proved. You'll find it less trouble to impose a ruler on the patricians than you encountered in imposing tribunes on them to resist their rule. Dictatorships and consulships must be leveled with the ground, that the Roman plebs may be enabled to lift its head. Stand by me, then. Prevent all court proceedings regarding moneys. I avow myself the patron of the commons, a title which, with my zeal and loyalty, have invested me. If you choose to give your leader a more striking title of authority and honor, you want to lower the consulships and dictators, you want something better than that. What could that be? What would that title be? Oh, no, it's not going to be king. No, couldn't be that. If you choose to give him a more striking title of authority or honor, you will find him the more able to make good your wishes. It was thus, they say, that the agitation for kingly power, that is regnum, was begun, and there is no very clear tradition with whom or to what length his plans were matured. So Livy, our writer, writing a couple hundred years later, doesn't really know what exactly happened, but it was a mess. So, now, at this point, when you get regnum involved, well, the Senate has to stand in. So, remember this whole thing, the Tarpeian Rock? The This is a little bit part of the Capitoline Hill, and well, if you got a big rock, what you gonna do with it? Well, you use it to get rid of traitors, and so they basically go back, arrest him, and this time they yeet him off the rock. And that is the end of Marcus Manlius Capitolinus. His greatest glory and his downfall come from the Capitoline Hill. Now, if you go there today, the Tarpeian Rock is not very impressive. I kind of want to think that it's just been eroded way down and that maybe it would have been a little bit higher in antiquity. I'm not exactly sure what the ground level would have been, but right now it looks more like the Tarpeian retaining wall. And if you were to toss somebody off of it, they'd probably break a leg. I guess if you get good backspin on them like you have in this picture, maybe you could like get the head to hit and, that would probably do it, but it's a little less impressive than it looks in all of these fanciful drawings here, but that's where you throw traitors off. So Marcus Manlius Capitolinus saves and is thrown off of later the Capitoline Hill. And that's what happens when you traffic in conspiracy theories and try to abuse them for your own power. Turn to the dark side of demagoguery.